On today's Plate of History Beans, I'll talk a little about stockyards and how the cattle industry transformed a small government outpost into a thriving city in the Old West. In the 1870s, the setting for hunting charm, stockyards already existed in Fort Worth, but the town itself was still small. Over the next 30 years, however, Fort Worth would become one of the wildest towns in the West, and in terms of population and commerce, one of the fastest growing. If you're looking for a specific date for the events in hunting charm, this chapter, perhaps more than any other in the book, places the book in the year 1875 or 1876. I will say that when writing the book, I fudged some on the history. My purpose was to tell a story. Apologies to historians. The reason you might date events to 1876 is because it was in July of that year the Texas and Pacific Railroad began offering service from Fort Worth to points east, north, and south. The railroad didn't offer service heading west yet, as the lands beyond Fort Worth in that direction, up until the same period, were still controlled largely by Plains Indians, most specifically the Comanche and Kiowa tribes. It wouldn't be long, however, before the Comanche were subdued and white settlers would flood into the Permian Basin and Llano Estacado to take over those places, just as whites had in other areas of the United States. The first stockyards in Fort Worth appeared around 1850. Built by the U.S. Army and Major Ripley Arnold. Those first stockyards, built alongside the Trinity River, would soon grow into an enormous, sprawling array of corrals and meatpacking facilities run mostly by what we now call robber barons. By 1880, thousands of cattle were being herded to Fort Worth and housed in one or another of the several stockyards in Fort Worth. The demand for corral space was so great that in 1887, the city of Fort Worth built the Union Stockyards with the help of a Boston investor, Greenleaf Simpson. The vast facility covered over 200 acres and made Fort Worth the biggest stockyard in the Southwest. As a side note, one wonders what the town of Fort Worth must have smelled like during those days. Even in modern times, stockyards emit a powerful aroma, one that can be smelled 50 or 60 miles away when the wind is right. Some folks call it the smell of money, but for those of us who aren't pocketing any of the cash, it just smells like, well, you get the picture. By 1890, the wild cow towns of Kansas had seen their best days, and the Chisholm Trail likewise had served its purpose. Why drive your cows to Kansas when you could go to Fort Worth? Meanwhile, Fort Worth, filled with brothels, saloons, and gambling houses, gave cowboys with coins in their pocket a place to blow off steam and, in some cases, pack a lifetime worth of experiences into a few days. The town of Fort Worth was a place ripe for an enterprising young woman like Doreen Tarwater in Hunting Charm to set herself up in business. Along with stockyards came other businesses, tanners to produce leather, though a good deal of that work went to Dallas, where tanners needed hides, since almost all of the buffalo that had been killed off. In case you didn't know, one of the biggest industries in Dallas, the thing that ostensibly built that city, was the processing of the vast number of hides harvested by buffalo hunters in the years between around 1840 to 1880. It's estimated that somewhere between 30 and 60 million buffalo hides were slaughtered in that period. Most of those hides were processed in Dallas. By 1890, however, there were almost no buffalo left to kill. Hides from meat processing interests in Fort Worth helped fill that void. Perhaps the biggest side business to accompany the stockyards in Fort Worth was the meat packing industry. The same men who financed the Fort Worth Stockyards, Greenleaf Simpson, also constructed the first major meatpacking facility in Fort Worth. The Fort Worth Dressed Meat and Packing Company. The invention of the refrigerated rail car enabled men like Greenleaf Simpson, Gustavus Swift, and Philip Danforth Armour, all of whom built meatpacking facilities in Fort Worth, to become some of the wealthiest men in the U.S. This was the era of the robber baron, and though ostensibly Upton Sinclair's novel The Jungle is based upon the meatpacking plants in Chicago, conditions in Fort Worth were no better. Workers in Fort Worth toiled endlessly for low wages in dangerous and unsanitary conditions, so Americans everywhere could enjoy a steak. In modern times, Fort Worth Stockyards are no longer in use for the purpose of housing or processing cattle. Instead, they have become a major tourist attraction. Fort Worth Stockyard District, which emphasizes the Old West, is nationally recognized as a historical area. It is home to restaurants, bars, nightclubs, the famous Billy Bob's, billed as the largest honky-tonk in the world with 100,000 feet of space inside and 20 acres of parking, is located in the historic district, as are places like the White Elephant Saloon, the Cowtown Coliseum, shopping venues like Letty's Bootmakers and Maverick Western Wear, and tons of other shops, restaurants, and bars, all Western themed, are located in the Fort Worth Stockyards Historical District. The Stockyard District also pays host to dozens of events each year, along with concerts and Old West cattle drive reenactments. Each year they have the PBR Stockyards Showcase and the Fort Worth Rodeo and Stock Show, along with street fairs and a host of other things. There's always something happening in the Stockyard District. If you're looking for Old West entertainment or just a family-friendly spot to hang out for a couple of days, downtown Fort Worth and the historic Stockyard District might suit you. That's it for today's Plate of History Beans. As always, if you like my content, I'll encourage you to hit the like and subscribe buttons. I would be truly grateful. Also, if you're following my book, Hunting Charm, I'll have a link below to my author's page on Amazon. Now it's time for Chapter 31 of Hunting Charm, A New Beginning. Chapter 31, A New Beginning. They rode for 3 days alongside freshly laid rails before coming upon a second camp of steel drivers. Doreen led the way, Henry following a few yards behind. Though some of the workers looked curiously at the odd pair, only one man spoke, asking about their destination. "Fort Worth," Doreen said. "Well, ma'am, you're on the right track. I'd say you're no more than 40 miles out. Boss man says this line will reach town by mid-July. Then you'll be able to get a train heading to Galveston or Kansas City. Hell, anywhere you please." The tracks they had been following ended at that point, but the well-maintained road continued. As they rode along, Doreen filled the hours musing about her plans or complaining about her past. At one point, recalling their conversation by the Red River, she asked about his hand. He stuttered through the tale of how he escaped Rosewood, his capture by slave catchers, his father's death, and the injury that had led to his appearance. "Them evil men put me in a box for many days. When I come out, my arm and my shoulder wasn't normal no more. I was near dead, and them slave catchers threw me in a ditch. I would likely have died except a old slave woman found me." Doreen said, "Oh my," several times and seemed concerned. Even so, when he paused, she changed the subject. Henry noted her discomfort and felt relieved Doreen didn't press for more details. He was unaccustomed to talking about himself and had no desire to relive the injustice that had changed his life forever. They arrived at the outskirts of Fort Worth the last week of May. Henry pitched their tents, started a small fire, and prepared a meal of beans and biscuits. The next morning, Doreen told him to remain behind and left for town. He busied himself working on a small wooden stool he had been crafting. Then around noon he wandered to a nearby promontory overlooking town. Henry had spent his life living in rural areas. In the 1870s, Fort Worth, growing quickly, sprawled over a 3-mile radius. There were two-story whitewashed buildings, businesses and churches, and near the outskirts a maze of corrals, precursors to the famed Union Stockyards that, in a few years, would transform the dusty cow town into the largest shipping point for cattle on the planet. There were already herds passing through bound for Kansas, Dallas, or south to Galveston. The streets bustled with an array of folks, colored, native, and white, civilians and soldiers, some traveling on foot, others by carriage, wagon, or on horseback. Despite the unnerving revelation that humanity could collect in such numbers, Henry felt a degree of excitement. He had never lived anywhere except Rosewood, and then as an adult in his modest 2-room home in remote Indian Territory. He had been thinking more and more about Doreen's suggestion that he might one day find a wife. That wouldn't be possible in Indian Territory, but in a city like Fort Worth, who knew what might happen? She returned late that afternoon in a new dress, blonde hair curled and coiffed, dazzlingly beautiful. She told him to strike camp. "We'll cross through town to a place I've found. Don't worry, it will be dark. Just follow along behind and you'll be fine." Doreen draped a blanket over his damaged back and adjusted his hat, pulling it low to hide his face. "If anyone addresses us, allow me to do the talking." As they approached the outskirts of town, Henry felt so nervous he could hardly think. The sounds and smells of the stockyard mixed with the aroma of chilies and cumin from the Mexican cantina made his head spin. From a saloon he heard the tinkle of a piano and the laughter of rowdy cowboys. An inebriated vaquero wearing a wide sombrero, chaps, and pointy, colorful boots fired his pistol into the air, then laughed heartily as he stumbled away. Doreen, seated side saddle on cotton socks, looked magnificent in her new clothes and elicited tipped hats from men and envious glances from women. Even though Doreen drew everyone's attention, the ride through town felt interminable. Every staggering cowboy, every carriage, every passing couple out for an evening stroll seemed ready to point an accusing finger in his direction. Even so, they soon passed the bustling midtown district, and the sounds of cattle and revelry faded. The bustling crowd dwindled to an occasional rider. Soon they turned from the broad main street and onto a side road, leaving the gaslit streets and houses behind. They traveled another 15 minutes through rolling brakes, the road still well maintained, then turned onto a brushy trail winding down a steep escarpment into a narrow ravine. As they made their way up the opposite side, Henry spotted a small rock house perched on the hillside. "There is a second building beyond the ridge," Doreen pointed. "You can just make out the roof." She pointed to a pair of gables barely visible in the moonlight. "It's a house of sorts, but also serves as a barn. It's the more recent structure and contains a good deal of lumber and tools left by the previous owner. I purchased the entire place, just over 6 acres and 2 buildings, for $80. Doreen motioned to the north. "This older house built of stone will be yours for now. If you need water, there are 2 wells, one just there." Doreen pointed to a rusty cast-iron pump jack near the stone cabin. "The other water is near the house. I will sleep there. Tomorrow we will begin renovating." She rode on, urging Cotton Socks up the hill, then over the ridge and out of sight. He sat for a long moment, gazing after her, then, when she disappeared, turned to examine his new home. He could tell very little about the old house in the darkness. His lamp had run dry of oil some days earlier. He decided to pitch his tent outside and, just as he had done for the past few weeks, made camp. After gathering wood, he struck a lucifer and soon had a small fire going. Pain from his damaged neck and shoulder often prevented him from resting soundly, so he remained seated there on a log, resting his back against a rock for some time, watching the stars and listening to the distant echoes of cattle from the stockyards. Finally, no longer able to keep his eyes open, he retired to his cot and slept. He woke early. In the morning light, he surveyed his new surroundings and was happy to find that even though the rock house hadn't been occupied recently, the cement-mortared walls were true and sound. The roof needed work, but there was flooring inside, wood, planking. He realized that the house, with a few repairs, would be both larger and more comfortable, given the wooden floors, than his place in Indian Territory. A decent wood stove rested in one corner upon a stone hearth. Alongside the stove were shelves, a table attached to the wall, and in another corner a steep, rough-hewn stairway. He examined the ladder, then, satisfied it would hold his weight, climbed upwards into a loft which contained a rusting bed frame, a rotting mattress, more shelving, and a dilapidated nightstand. The center of the room was tall enough for Henry to stand. A trio of mice skittered across the floor to their home within the old mattress. Holding his breath to avoid breathing a cloud of dust, Henry tugged the ragged thing from the bed and cast it down the stairs. Recalling the money given to him by Doreen, he wondered how much it would cost to buy a new mattress. Descending the ladder, Henry dragged the ragged mess outside and tossed the thing into the ravine. Curious about the other building, he walked up the hillside and circled through a stand of elms to the top of the ridge. The second house, as Doreen had suggested, was a more modern structure built of milled lumber. With a practiced eye, Henry reckoned the structure to be no more than 5 years old. He didn't know much about the cost of things, but nevertheless wondered if Doreen had offered other considerations to consummate her purchase of the place. He settled into a wooden chair that rested beneath a towering sycamore and made a mental list of materials he would need to begin repairs: paint, nails, pitch for the roof. With 2 pack mules, Henry had brought along many of his tools, reasoning that he might never return. Unfortunately, he had not brought along his large cross-cut saw or makeshift milling rail. It didn't matter, he realized. Even though there were trees in the area, they had left behind the thickly forested region inhabited by the creek. If they needed boards, they would have to buy them. Though Henry had little experience when it came to purchasing things, he knew that milled lumber could be expensive. Doreen had yet to appear, and he dared not enter the house to examine the interior without her permission. Eventually he grew bored, wandered back to his own camp, and began organizing his things into the rock house. Almost 3 hours later, the cool morning passed. He heard the hand pump and wandered back up the hill. Doreen, unaware or unconcerned that Henry caught a glimpse of her calves as she washed, turned as he emerged from the elms. "Good, you're up. Come on and let me show you the inside so we can discuss plans." Henry didn't bother mentioning that he had been up for hours. Instead, he turned his attention to the house. He had already concluded that the lower level of the 2-story structure had served as a barn. He had seen similar houses built by a colony of German people who settled 40 miles to the north of Jake McQueen's ranch. "Living space upstairs?" he asked. "Yes, and they obviously kept animals in this area." Doreen pointed to a series of stalls against one wall. "There's quite a lot of space. The owner's wife passed, and he went soon thereafter. They were both older folks. They left a comfortable bed and sofa and a decent stove upstairs. I think the banker may have been taken with me when he agreed to sell." She gave Henry a knowing wink. Doreen spent the next few minutes talking about ways she hoped to renovate the place. Henry surveyed the construction, the framework of peeled pine logs seemed capable of withstanding the weather. Like the exterior, the inside needed paint, but otherwise, everything seemed to be in solid condition. All in all, the place seemed well suited for Doreen's plan. Upstairs, the former owners had created a comfortable living space. The walls were paneled and had an insulated space between the interior and exterior sheathing. In the main living area, there were rugs, a newer-looking stove with polished steel fixtures, pots and kitchen utensils, an oak dining table with chairs, and a comfortable-looking sofa. In a second room, the owners left a four-poster bed, a dresser of drawers, and against the wall, near a window, an enormous copper bathtub with lion's paw feet. "There's a pulley right outside the window." Doreen waved him back into the first room and pointed to the shuttered casement near the stove. "You can haul water up and heat it right on the stove, though the rope is rotted and needs replacing. I would like the water-drawing mechanism repaired, and perhaps we could move the tub downstairs. I hope to begin entertaining a few select clients in 2 weeks. Having a place to bathe would be marvelous. Do you feel that would be possible?"
I need to look around a bit more, ma'am, if that's okay."
"Of course." Doreen's smile illuminated the room. He spent the next half hour surveying things. He found several tools left by the previous owner, including a pair of fine-looking saws. "How long will it take," Doreen asked, to make all the changes?"
"I reckon in 2 weeks we could have some folks in for drinks and such. I need another man to help. Looks like you're going to need a good many things."
"How much do you expect it will all cost?"
"Well, miss, I don't rightly know. Like I said, I ain't had much experience with money and such."
Doreen nodded. "I can help with the painting. I haven't much experience, but I'm willing to work. Do you know how to write?"
"My right hand ain't no good for writing, though I can read right well."
"Okay, then if you'll tell me what we need to get started, I'll make a list." From her bag, Doreen found a pencil and leather-bound booklet. For the next few minutes, Henry listed items: lumber, paint, caulking, plasters, tar, nails. Finally, he grew silent. "Is that everything?" Doreen asked.
"Yes, ma'am, I reckon so. Leastwise, that will get us going. There is one other thing, though."
"What?"
"Well, I ain't had nothing to eat since yesterday morning. I'm right hungry, and I ain't much when it comes to handling a gun for hunting."
Doreen nodded. "Of course, Henry, I'm sorry. I completely forgot. I'm going into town to get these things, and I'll get food as well. For now, there are a few canned goods in the kitchen. Perhaps you can find something there. Fortunately, we still have money, and She paused for a moment and said, "I promise we won't go hungry."